Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Personnel Service Forecasting 1 at the Budget Line of Business Spring 2024 Virtual Forum. I'm your host today, Janice Butler. I am the Budget Line of Business Budget SME Senior Advisor for Program Management Office. The Budget Line of Business PMO works with our 27 partner agency budget offices to develop modern, adaptable, cost-effective solutions for the federal budget community, process technology, and training. I will be managing your chat box today. If you have any questions, please include them in the chat box for our presenters. Please remain on mute and off webcam while the presenters are speaking to reduce background noise. After the final session on Wednesday, we'll be sending out a post-session survey that will only take a few minutes of your time, whether you attend one session or multiples. We appreciate your feedback. And finally, today we will be recording today's session. We've also put in the chat where you can find our agenda, and our presentation and recording will be on the agenda and presentation page. I'll start with introducing our speakers. Today, most of you are familiar with, and for those new, Andrew Pavord, aka Andy. He's the founder of the Federal Consultant Alliance. He's led budget processes for the DC government, the U.S. Small Business Administration, and the U.S. Department of Treasury. He also serves as the Budget Line of Business Training Coordinator. Also, we have Rick Taylor. He served over 34 years in the fields of financial management and budgeting for programs in defense, law enforcement, regulatory, and scientific agency. He has extensive experience in federal working capital fund and appropriation. Rick, Andy, it's all yours. Thank you so much. Oh, and our ASL interpreters, we do have ASL interpreters on with us today. We have Antonio Goodwin and Katora Lee. Thank you. Andy, Rick, all yours.
Okay, I'm going to start us off, and today's topic is really important to budgeting. You know, for many organizations, personal services are a huge part of their budget. And so properly forecasting the amount that you're going to obligate or spend is really critical for both to formulation, right? Because you need to know how much the personal services are going to cost, and to execution, because you need to know each month and to forecast for year end. So this is a critical class we're going to discuss today. And we're going to start off by reviewing common terms. We're going to discuss what is forecasting, understand the concept. Then we're going to describe the uses of personal cost forecasting. We're going to describe the unique nature of personal cost forecasting because it's very different than forecasting things like contracts or non-personal service expenditures. We're going to talk about the forecasting cycle, how to get started in forecasting, and then we'll give you some tips. And finally, we'll do a practice scenario using a tool we've developed on how to price existing staff. Then this afternoon, we'll move into topics more related to budget execution and also formulation of new initiatives. So let's start with some definitions, because that's if we don't speak the same language, we won't be able to understand each other. So we got to get clear on terms. And terminology is very important in personal services forecasting because, there's a lot of confusion that people have when they get mixed up on how they use terms. So precise terms used precisely is what we're trying to achieve. So let's start with the concept of position, or sometimes in the military DoD world, they call it billets. A position is an occupied or vacant staffing allocation to an organization. So it's an approved position that exists in an organization. It has to be tied to an organization to be a position. And so the position gives you the total number of people that could work for a given organization. Now, we know that in no organization are positions ever all filled at any given time. There's always vacancies. People retire, people quit. The hiring process, as you all know from bitter experience, can take a long time. So there's always some vacancy. But position is a useful concept because you know what essentially is the maximum total number of positions that you can have at any given time. The next term we're going to talk about is full-time equivalent. Now, this is defined And it's very important to get this definition straight in OMB Circular A11. And I'm just going to read this and we're going to talk about it a little bit. Full-time equivalent employment means the total number of regular straight time hours worked, not including overtime or holiday hours worked. So when you talk about FTE, we're not talking about, extra work, non-regular work, such as overtime or holiday hours. And then it's divided by the compensable hours applicable to each fiscal year. Now, normally in a 52-week year, you would think 40 times 52 equals 2,080. But we know that some years are different than others because of the variations of the calendar. So you need to go to Section 85 of OMB Circular A11 that tells you the total number of hours each that are available to work in a given year. So that's how again, it's the division by the total number of hours of regular straight time hours worked divided by the annual hours worked as determined in Section 85 of OMB Circular A11. Now, it's important not to confuse full-time permanent, which is a type of employment category, with full-time equivalent. Full-time permanent means basically a full-time job, but we know there are people in the federal government who work part-time or term appointments and things like that. So make sure you understand what FTE is. Then there's the term headcount or end of strength or onboards. And this is a count of the actual numbers of persons employed by an agency at a given time. It's essentially the payroll, the list of everybody who's getting paid. But it's important to note that full-time equivalent does not equal headcount because, again, there's part-time people, there's people on leave and things like that. So let's go to the next concept, regular pay. Regular salaries and wages paid to the employees, some of which may be withheld from an employee's check to pay taxes, bills to credit unions, or pays the employee's share of health and life insurance. But this is a key concept because that's what gets done for FTE. There are other payments that are part of their basic pay. For example, geographic wage differentials and critical position pay, such as law enforcement pay. Regular salaries and wages paid while the employees are on paid leave, such as annual sick or compensatory leave, count for regular pay, and it goes into the FTE calculation. Lump sum, it also includes lump sum payments for annual leave upon separation, which, terminal leave. You've all heard about that. Some of you are looking forward to getting that in the near future. Finally, there is other pay. And this is pay above the basic rates paid directly to employment. Most common elements of other pay include overtime, holiday pay, differentials for night work, cash, and performance awards. Now let's talk about benefits. Benefits are obligations recorded in Object Class 12. Regular compensation is Object Class 11. And benefits include things like insurance, life insurance, health insurance, vision, dental, retirement contributions, Federal Insurance Contributions Act. Now, these are all things paid by the federal government as an employer. And so they create what, part of the benefits pay rate that we're going to calculate later on. And then there's miscellaneous things like professional liability insurance that's paid by the government, recruiting and retention, relocation fees paid by the government, public transportation, your metro payments, and there's other items that can be in benefits. This is a key concept within grade increases. You all know that in the federal government, step increases are periodic increases in GS employees' rate of pay based on time and grade and requiring an acceptable level of performance. So if you do your job, you get your wage and grade increase. Compensation. For our purposes, the sum of regular pay and benefits paid by the employer. Okay, compensation is the total of Object Class 11 and 12. Average compensation is a term what you're going to see in the model we present later, is the total compensation divided by a relative base, such as occupied position or FTE. For our purposes, we're going to focus on FTE. Okay, question. Describe the difference between a count of positions and an FTE. You can either just put it in the chat, take a minute, make sure we all understand this basic concept. Or does someone just want to speak up? Number of people. Oh, go ahead.
Okay. Is it hours of work is FTEs and on board count, the actual bodies or position?
Right. It's hours of work divided by the total annual, right? So if it's 20, it happens to be 2080, that's the count. So I think you have the basic ideas. Positions count occupied or vacant staffing allocations to an organization. So it's the maximum amount you could have. FTE describes the number of hours paid work compared to available hours for a day, week, or year. Okay, I'm going to now turn it over to Rick, and he's going to take over, and we're going to talk about forecasting.
Great, thank you, Andy. One thing on that too is if you ever see a list that's supposedly FTE and it has names attached, then it's not. It's something else. So that's just a good way to judge like what the data you're looking at looks like. So forecasting. Next slide, please. So like Andy said, first thing we want to lay out kind of what the terms mean. So what's the difference between a schedule or a plan and a forecast? Why do we use different words for those? And it's really important to call out a schedule or a plan lays out what events are desired to occur. It's when you want things to happen. I want to take, a vacation in 6 months or, something like that. Or as I hear, the agency wants to double the number of inspectors at the end of the next fiscal year. So it's important to differentiate them because, and I like to say, notice it's called a weather forecast, not a weather plan. The weather people don't know when it's going to rain. They're guessing with a lot of education, a lot of data behind it to try to predict when something's going to happen. A plan is that, it could be a stretch goal. It could be reaching for an outcome that is desired and there's a lot of risk or a lot of, danger in not achieving it, but that's what's desired. A forecast portrays when events are likely to occur based on experience and projections, where existing or changed processes can achieve these events. So let's say we're back at that agency, a forecast might say, we've never hired that many people that fast using our current process. So if we're going to achieve that plan, we're going to need to change something about our hiring processes and onboarding procedures to make that more likely that it's achievable. But right now, the forecast doesn't support achieving that plan. And hopefully a forecast is done sort of independently and separately from a plan so it can point out those sort of differences. And then the organization can respond in a variety of ways. They might modify the plan. They might change a process to speed it up, look at those sort of things. But it's important because there might be resources needed to modify that process or to achieve that plan. So just keep in mind a schedule or a plan and a forecast are not the same thing. Next slide. So here's a little representation of the cycle, and it really is a cycle in that it starts and then it kind of keeps going round and round as you go through things. So it begins with collecting historical or actual data to get an understanding of the time frame and the timing of events. What sort of seasonality or periodical things affect your agency and its workforce. Some agencies hire at the end of an academic cycle when people are coming off their PhD graduations, and therefore hiring takes place mainly in the summertime into the fall. And it's really not going to take place much in the spring, no matter really how much you want because of the type of positions. Things like that. It's important to understand that. It's also important to get an understanding of leadership's risk tolerance for techniques that could reduce certain events in timing and like onboarding. There's things that can be done, and we'll go into those a little bit later this afternoon. The information learned in the previous step, still back on the cycle, Andy. Thanks. The information learned in the previous step is used to compile the forecast for the upcoming period. So you use that data, you use the understanding, you blend those together to make projections of what you think is going to happen in the future. When you think people are going to come on board, when a pay raise is going to occur. That one's usually pretty good. It's usually in January, but it has been delayed in the past for different reasons. And then you combine that with actual data as you go through the year and kind of compare, and not kind of, you compare where your forecast is against the actual data. Are they trending together? Is something in the actual data causing the forecast to become questionable, either too high or too low? And you look at that and reevaluate it. The next step is reporting those projections to leadership and stakeholders. So how's the forecast doing? Are we on track? Are we off track? Are we spending fast or hot? Are we spending too slow? And then adjustments can be made to activities to try to bring the forecast or the actual data in line with the forecast, or the forecast can be modified. And that brings us back to the beginning of collecting historical or actual data again to try to compare, where things are headed and if something new has changed that's going to influence the projection in the future. Okay. So, one of the things that's important to understand is the nature of forecasting. It's just, what this beast looks like. No matter how many factors you include, how much data you gather, or how rigorous your technique, your forecast will most likely not be perfect in predicting the future. And if you can get perfect forecasts, there are much more remunerative positions that will take advantage of that. Nobody can do a perfect forecast. As we used to say at the SEC, past results are no guarantee of future returns. So, no one can see the future. The best we can do is make educated guesses or educated, projections of it. And remember, there's a very tight tolerance for forecasting in that you can be 99.9% accurate on a $2 billion compensation budget, and that difference will be $2 million. So it's going to generate, a chunk of money because the base is so big. So it's important to understand that's just the nature of the beast. I mean, no matter how accurate you are, if you're not right on, then there's going to be a delta that has to be dealt with. Again, the forecasts for weather are a good understanding of trying to keep this in mind. If you look at a hurricane chart, when a hurricane is 5 days from expected landfall, that big cone they show on the map, which is actually the statistical variation of where they think the center of the hurricane could move. It's not where the area of hurricane effects, as they label it, will be felt, but it's where they think the eye of the hurricane will move. They're using a circle with a 400-mile diameter. That's over 126,000 square miles. So it tells you 5 days away, they're still giving themselves a huge range of possibility of where that storm could hit. And that's why it's so hard. And, that's the best forecast all our technology can bring to bear on that issue because of the variable nature of it. Your forecasts will probably be a little narrower than that. But the idea, again, is that forecasts are not going to predict the future perfectly, and other things are going to influence them. Time to hire, attrition timing, that will all greatly influence the outcome. And you have to state those assumptions and make your model so that different figures in those assumptions can be factored in, and you can kind of see where that moves the needle, so to speak, and to compare those different outcomes and see which one is tending to predict the current future, the current year, the budget year more accurately. Probably the greatest challenge in forecasting, and we'll talk about this more, forecasting personnel services or compensation, is that leadership has very little control over the timing of events. There's a little bit about onboarding, you can move it a little bit, and there's a little bit under very special circumstances about when people leave. But other than that, it's really the amalgamation of thousands of individual decisions by the employees about when they might agree to an onboarding date, or when they might decide to retire, or when they might decide to leave the agency for another agency or another position. So all of that is not something that can be managed by leadership in the way other things can. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind about that. The other thing about personnel forecasting that's important is that time is a key element in all this, because the fiscal year is a fixed period. If something happens earlier or later than was forecasted, it's going to have an impact on that forecast. And again, that timing of events is also very little under control. And once that time is elapsed, once it's mid-year, you can't go back and make things better. Boy, if we'd hired 50 people back in February, our forecast would be perfect. Well, you can't do that. You might be able to adjust something a little bit in the future, but many times once that time is elapsed, there's no going back to fix it, and the forecast has to be revised to deal with that. That's part of that cycle we were talking about. Okay, Andy?
Hey, I just want to say, if you have a question, I should have said this in the beginning, please put it in the chat and we'll try to, I'll be watching the questions as Rick talks, and we will address them. So if you have questions, please ask them in the chat.
Thank you, Andy. So one of the best ways to talk about this, and here's some a little bit fancier terms for what we were talking about before, between the difference between a schedule and a plan, is a forecast needs to be probabilistic, an approach that is based on how likely something is to happen. So one, that it happens, and two, the timing of it. A plan is often deterministically an approach that believes everything that happens must happen as it does or could not have happened in any other way. In other words, we're going to achieve this, this on this date. We plan that we're going to have 3,500 personnel hired within this fiscal year. The probabilistic approach says, we're going to need 25 months using our current process to bring that many people on board. And 25 months is a little over 2 fiscal years. So, that's the sort of difference. The forecast has to be probabilistically. Wishes and dreams aren't really forecasting. Those have other roles and things. As Colin Powell used to say, hope is not a strategy. You really need to be hard-knuckled on when is this really likely to happen, unless something changes that maybe can influence it, but this is when it's likely to happen, and based on experience. And those short and long-term forecasts, we're understanding that shorter forecasts are more accurate than longer ones. I can predict, pretty highly what I'm going to do in the next 10 minutes. I'm still going to be teaching this class. Ask me to do what I'm going to do in 6 months, I might have some ideas, but things can, change a great deal. And again, it's lastly important to reforecast when you get new information. If a milestone, let's say in hiring, isn't achieved, then that needs to be pushed through the rest of the forecast to see how it affects the outcome. Some more principles just to go over, and I won't try to read every one of these. The reference here from Vicati, a forecast is a calculation about the future that includes both a range and a probability of the range occurring. So we'll talk about that a little bit, about how to present forecasts so that it's understood by users, decision makers, leadership, that what's entailed in the forecast. A range can be, there's a given cost between 100 and 150K of some item for a given year. So when it happens during the fiscal year and what that range possibly could be. And it could be a plus or minus. You could say it's going to be $100,000 plus or minus 50K or 25K. Again, it's that range that's going to show the possible outcomes. That range is going to be influenced by deviations from plan. Sufficient people could not be found using the traditional recruitment practice, so our hiring was delayed. Timing issues, there was some disruption, maybe like a CR where you couldn't bring people on board when you wanted to, and that's going to influence when something is going to happen in a forecast. Again, probability is the likelihood that the outcome will be within the existing range. So again, if you're very confident, you've got good cost backup data, you've got good confidence that something is going to come in between that 100 and 150K range, then that might have a higher probability. Something like this 85% is. But that's got to be driven and influenced by uncertainty. Is this a new thing we're doing? Have we done it before? Is this new thing like previous things, or is it very different? Major events. You may work in an area where you have major private sector hiring competition. And therefore, when the private sector kicks up, it sucks a lot of air out of the room and makes it very difficult to hire for the positions you're seeking, or vice versa. You may have an opportunity if the private sector is slowed down. And change in plans. Your funds get rescinded by Congress. Something else occurs. Some sort of natural disaster affects the agency, and you have to direct those money to recovery efforts. All those things can influence the forecast and require it to be redone. So here's a depiction of, again, the range of forecasts. The core thing of the blue columns and yet range can be depicted saying these are the things that it can influence that estimate to be above or below that middle line established by the top of those columns. That sort of technique can be helpful to describe it. So can making very clear the assumptions that are built into the forecast. If possible, it's kind of nice to have almost a little summary of the assumptions in each forecast or each forecast set, the key assumptions that are there. Let's say maybe the pay raise or the hiring pace or the pay raise used. Those are key elements that need to be called out to differentiate, one forecast from another. Next slide, please. So as we talked about, it's important to reforecast when you get information. And if you just have a static forecast that stays the same, it's more and more likely it will not be a good predictor of the future outcome. And so policy changes could affect that. Perhaps the federal government, OPM, will put out new guidance that fundamentally changes our hiring process and makes it a lot faster, or even possibly take even longer, and that would affect it. Economic changes, like I said before, if the economy goes a certain way and private sector hiring moves, that can affect government hiring, especially in certain occupations. Operational issues, again, a hurricane hits an office building, a regional office you have in Houston, and now money is needed to repair the building versus used for salaries and expenses. So that has to be reoriented. Your budget execution review should focus. I'm sorry, Andy, can you go back to the, thanks. Your budget execution review should focus on identifying relevant new information. What are the key things that are going to impact the forecast? Some things may not, or only may do it in a very small sense. Others could have a great big impact. And always be ready to explain why your forecast has changed. The pay raise was, many times the president's budget has a certain pay raise and Congress passes a different president's budget. So as you do your operating plan forecast, you'd have to incorporate what actually was enacted by Congress, not necessarily what was in the president's budget. So there's an important example of new information that would change a forecast. It's very analogous to navigators, will take, they try to determine where their ship is, and then they take new information, new soundings, new measurements, new observations to make sure they know where they are, and so they can determine where they're going. So some of the uses of personnel forecasting, Andy hinted on this a little bit, is first of all, budgeting for overall personnel cost. In some agencies, personnel cost compensation can run 70% of their total budget. If they don't have big acquisition programs for material, then personnel is likely to be a major part of their budget. And it's required for budget inputs for MACs, the CJs, and other reports. It's just, it's ubiquitous. It's got to be in there. It can indicate potential workforce or workload imbalances. In other words, again, you can have a work plan to hire a certain number of people in a given occupation, and your forecast can show that that's going to be difficult to achieve again with this current process, or based on historical information, why that there's an imbalance there, something has to give. Or it could be something like a training or recruitment pipeline. If you work in an occupation like a lot of law enforcement positions that have an academy period, in other words, people that are accepted have to go to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Academy for 12 weeks. That's just part of the nature. That has a fixed capacity or throughput over a given time. And so if there's a lot of hiring that doesn't match that throughput, that needs to be reconciled in order to achieve that outcome. And then ensuring compliance with legislative requirements such as minimum staffing levels. Occasionally, Congress has written into both report language and sometimes appropriation language that an agency has to maintain a staffing not less than a certain amount. Or they might say, again, in report language as a recommendation, very strong recommendation, or in the appropriation as a law requirement that, a certain end strength will be achieved as of a certain date, or, a certain FTE level will be generated during the year. So again, those are important to be able to measure against those and make sure the agency is complying where necessary. Again, we talked about the formulation of the budget request. These are kind of the three big things. The forecast is used, the budget, the entire budget's a forecast. So all of it is, really personnel and non-personnel is a forecast. Again, personnel can be a really great, big piece of it. The operating plan, that's that plan that agencies do, once they get their funding level or once they get their prospective funding level, like a House or Senate mark, to try and describe, okay, I did the budget 2 years ago. Now here I am on the cusp of a new fiscal year. How good was that budget forecast? It's really a revalidation or a reestimation of the forecast, given new information at the start or right before the start of a new fiscal year, to see how, what's changed and how those various funding levels may meet that change. And of course, execution monitoring is monitoring that execution, throughout the year to see, how the forecast compares to actual data. We talked about this a little bit, but I wanted to make sure it's in here again for emphasis, is that leadership will have very little control over the timing of most personnel events. It can't be said too often in the personnel realm that leadership, again, without very severe actions, hiring freezes, or what's called a reduction in force, which hasn't been really heard of in the federal government in a generation. But unfortunately, those of us that were around, excuse me, in the 80s and 90s, it was a reality that we faced, kind of every budget cycle. Those are really very unwieldy and very imprecise tools for leadership to try to influence staffing levels in a negative sense. Even on the positive sense, there's only marginal things that leadership can really do. And that is tough for sort of leadership sometimes to get their head around, especially maybe if you have leadership that's come from a very dynamic, private sector environment where hiring and workforce shaping, I'll call it, was, very much under leadership control. That's going to be, a really important thing for them to have to mentally shift to.
Rick, we need to slow down a little bit. Okay.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Again, the timing also is inescapable. It's the old time and tide wait for no man. Once the clock clicks over to a new month, that previous month, and anything you could have done then is gone. And so that's just got to be recognized, that time is such an important element in personnel forecasting issues. Also, there's very little leadership control kind of at the macro level. And talk about that in terms of, what insurance plan an individual chooses at what level of coverage. Do they take the very cheapest traditional, Blue Cross Blue Shield for single only? Or do they take, family at the most expensive high option plan, on the OPM chart? Leadership has no control of that. Do they, do other things? What level of retirement do they participate in? Now the law is that new employees automatically are set at the 5% match, but that wasn't always that way. And they can choose to change that. And that affects the employers or the agencies share how much they pay into that. So all those little micro decisions are not up to leadership. And, it's sort of like snowflakes. It's not the first one that shuts down the city, but when they're added all together, they can have an impact. And so that stuff also is completely outside of any decision-making control. So we'll go back a little bit just to refresh, and please in the chat, put in your description of the difference between a forecast and a plan.
And you can also put any other questions you have.
Yes, thank you.
But we'll just go to the answer. Okay, we have forecast as a projection based on experience. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And also knowledge of things that are going to happen can adjust your forecast, right? Forecast is what you think could happen. Plan has a specific goal. Good. Plan is what you would like to happen. Forecast is what is likely to happen. That's a good point.
Yeah.
And includes the likelihood of different outcomes. Good. Forecast is based on historical and future data, known events, for example. Plan is an outline of expected steps. Good. I think you're getting the concepts here. Forecast is based on historical, and plan is based on anticipated, and not just anticipated, but it's what you want to happen.
I think it's important too that a forecast doesn't say it has to be this way. It just says based on experience and and the best data we have available, this is where we think it's going to go. Again, it doesn't mean that, well, there's just nothing we can do about it. There are things that can change. Agencies can modify their hiring process, look for innovative or, new ways to do things. And so one shouldn't fall into the trap of, well, the forecast says X and that's what's going to, that's what's going to happen, plus or minus a little bit. No, the agency can change it, but they just need to know what levers of power they have to make changes to it. And then, and knowing that it may not move the forecast much, but it doesn't want to imply that sort of everything's set in concrete and there's no options. We got another question that follows this one up real quick. What are the core principles of forecasting? We laid out a few in the slides that are kind of the 3 main points, I think. I always have to remember that the chat's behind, so the typing is going on furiously.
Give it a minute.
Yep.
Should be updated as you receive new information, correct? Probabilistic versus deterministic, correct? Good.
Yep.
Thank you. Range, there's a range in probability. Thank you. We update as received information, yes. Short and long term, good. So with reforecasting, realistic based on past performance. Yeah, we're getting the main ideas are coming out. Good, great. So we'll just go to the next slide, and the 3 key points we'd like you to take away are: think probabilistically, not deterministically. Make short, long-term forecasts with the understanding that shorter forecasts will be more accurate than longer ones, and reforecast when you get more information. So those are the 3 key points we hope you take away. Oh, go ahead, Rick.
This is where we had a break, but we can go ahead and move that a little bit later if we want to.
Yeah, we'll give it a few more minutes. We'll take a break around 9:50.
Yeah, let's do that.
Go ahead, Rick.
All right. Yep. All right. So where do I start? As we talked about, the first step was to gather historic and current cost levels. Work with your finance center to get what reports might be available, and they may need to be modified or changed to get you the data you want. You want to get data at the lowest level of detail possible, really at the transaction level, because you can always summarize up. But it's very difficult if you get summary data to drill down, if it's not backed up by that detail. It becomes very unwieldy, and it just, lessens the, some say granularity of your plan. You can't plan at that lower level to see what's going on, and you might need to do projections or forecasts, at a branch level or, a division level, not just the complete agency. And so it's important to have that, especially in agencies. I won't say just large ones, but ones where the different organizations are subject to different, occupations, different hiring pressures, different hiring environments. One might be hiring attorneys, other ones might be hiring officers. Those are different bases of people that are applying for those positions, and one forecast will probably not match both of them. And be aware of events in the past that render some prior period unique. Like, I don't know, something that happened in 2020 that kind of blew everything, everybody's forecast, those sort of thing. One, it's hard to plan for those black swan events like COVID, but it's pretty much become, we haven't had a year without any CRs since the 70s. So, pretty much having a CR and how that affects things has got to be factored into a good forecast, a reasonable forecast now. It just is a fact of life. Whether it lasts 3 months or 6 months might be, kind of the sensitivity. But the fact that we're likely to have a CR is pretty much established anymore. I don't see us getting away from that for anytime soon. Work with your human resources office and other stakeholders, such as your training office. If your positions have a long training pipeline between when they're hired and when they're, sort of on duty. Those all need to be consulted to make sure that, what's reasonable. Again, what's probabilistically going to happen based on past experience, unless we change the current process. Has the agency executed a large hiring effort that might be contemplated? Have they done that in the past? Do they have a playbook they can go back to and look at and see what they've learned from that? If a position has unique training needs, like I said, how can you absorb additional employees? Do you have the throughput at that process to deal with a surge? If the agency leadership wants to, bring on a lot more people faster, that's probably going to be a bottleneck. Another position that has a long training pipeline, I understand, is air traffic controllers, which we all support. We want them to be fully trained. But again, that's a long time it takes to train them. That's got to be factored in between when they're hired and when they're sort of, I'll say a journeyman, ready to operate on their own. And it also comes down sometimes to something as mundane as, is there space at a location? You want to put 500 people in your Houston office. Well, do they have space for them? I mean, that's somewhat lessened again by the rise of telework and hybridized workplaces. But, it still can be a concern, especially if it's a workforce that does require to be on site for whatever reason. Is there the physical space? And that might be the bottleneck that says, well, we can't hire people that fast because we'll have no place for them to do the work when they get here unless we do this other thing first. So it's all important to look at it holistically, and again, look at all the factors that might influence the hiring timeline for the forecast. This comes down to, most salaries and benefits, most payroll is done with 1 year appropriations. And so the only purpose is to, ask for the amount of money needed to cover those positions for the time they're on board during that fiscal year. You don't ask for a full position cost, let's say $200,000 with benefits for a position that's not coming on, is not projected to come on until, let's say, July, the last quarter. You don't need 3/4 of that funding, and you would just create an area for the agency to have to find some alternative use, or worse, let that funding lapse. And so therefore, it's, that's why the timing is so important, so that your request and your budgeted amounts match up with your requirements. Okay. So some tips on building a model or a forecast for this. It's got to be able to incorporate new actual data as it becomes available at that same level of detail. And what I mean is, you don't want to build a process that may have taken you weeks and weeks to do the first time, and every time you have to update the data, it takes weeks and weeks to do it because of you've got to hand enter all the data or something like that. You really want to build the model with the eye towards rapidly updating. In payroll and compensation, the coin of the realm is pay period. Every 2 weeks, a week or so after the pay period ends, just like when you get your direct deposit, that data is probably in your accounting system and can be uploaded into your model. And so you want to make that intake, using an upload process to be able to respond to that. So you have that, if you have to go monthly, that's one thing, but that data is available every 2 weeks, and it's better if you can use that. The model should be able to incorporate new updated projections from the most recent data. So it should be set up so that when you load new actual data, it automatically, at least in one assumption set, I'll call it, incorporates that into its projection. You might have others where you want to kind of take a look at it and kind of shape it a little bit, again, with that probabilistic mindset. But you should have at least one where it sort of automatically says, well, based on all our other assumptions, this new data says this is where we're headed at the end of the year.
So there's a good comment in the chat. Person gave a good example of, we had a significant drop in personnel due to relocation effort. It made that year's data somewhat unusable for forecasting purposes. Well, so you build that into the model in the sense that you brief it to your senior leaders that, hey, we have no idea that, we're moving everybody from Washington to Kansas City or whatever, and we don't know how many people are going to, refuse to relocate. We don't know how long it's going to take to hire new people. So that impacts the model.
Yeah.
But you kind of probably knew that this relocation effort was coming, so you can at least brief your senior leaders that, this is going to create uncertainty and that needs to be reflected in the model. So that's a great example. Thank you.
Yeah, and I took it as, in 2 years from now, when you want to look back at historical data, you need to have almost a little asterisk next to 2024 that says, oh yeah, we had that relocation thing and it dropped, that's going to have this bubble in the data that we need to compensate for. But again, that's part of being aware and being, very familiar with your historical data in that first step of the process.
Another example of something that I think a lot of agencies are dealing with right now is the bringing people back to work issue, because that's really impacting, retention rates and new hire rates, because there's so much change in the workforce right now. So that certainly will impact your model.
Yeah, thank you. The other thing the model should be able to do is to holistically apply inflationary factors to current year costs when there's not more specific information. So, inflationary factors like a pay raise or even, projected raises in benefit costs, and as most of us know, insurance has been going up faster than pay, unfortunately. And so those factors need to be incorporated, again, without going into 8,700 cells and, all updating the, inflation factor if you want to see what, a 4% pay raise looks like versus a 3% pay raise. So those things have to be structured so that it can be done holistically without, a major change to update it. Again, that's part of that, being able to incorporate new data without a huge effort. It should be able to do what if scenarios, kind of leading into that, different changes in assumptions, a greater or lesser pay rate, a different timing of onboarding, be able to do different versions of the projection. And so they can be compared. If you have to only do sort of one at a time, you end up having to do one and then sort of like find, park that data somewhere else and then do another one and park that data somewhere. Ideally, you can look at, different projections against each other and kind of see, kind of where the different trend lines go to get you to, okay, this is kind of the highs and lows and this is the middle, and it gives you the much more ability to kind of see what the differences are without having to re-enter everything into a, separate spreadsheet or anything. And then lastly, the model needs to report the projections in both the outcome, the actuals and the potential outcomes in a way that's useful to your leadership and a level of detail they find helpful. And that could vary because, division director might want to see it at their level, department level, bureau level, a cabinet level, agency level. All those are different depending on the decision maker looking at the data and what they find useful. Some people like charts and graphs. Some people like tables. It all just depends on what your particular leadership at a given time wants to be able to see in the data. Next slide. So a real quick question, point on unions and collective bargaining agreements. So your agency may not have it, but many agencies do have a union or a collective bargaining agreement. Federal employees have the right to organize, bargain collectively with their employers, and choose whether to participate in labor organizations without fear of retaliation. It's the law. A collective bargaining agreement, or CBA, is a written agreement establishing the relationship framework between management and the union that's binding on both parties. Now, most CBAs in the federal government do not include pay and benefit provisions, but some do. So it's very important to understand your collective bargaining agreement and whether it affects pay and benefit provisions. If you have it, you've got to understand that and understand its effect on that.
Okay, we have a couple of questions. The first is, where can we find information on inflationary adjustments to use in forecasts? And I think, go ahead, Rick.
I was going to say, I'm smiling just because we're the font of all knowledge for our OMB colleagues, the A11. That's really the best place to go unless there's been later guidance provided. The A11 will, they'll usually have a guidance letter that goes out for the pay raise, but the A11 has analytical perspectives as one of the other, a lot of times we go straight to the appendix to, of course, look at the budget request. But the analytical perspectives has a variety of tables where it provides OMB's sometimes long terms, I think they're 10-year projections for things like basic inflation and other data. So I would say that's a great place to start. Plus, when you get into, when you get to the level the OMB submit in the fall and they say, well, where'd you get these, projection numbers? What's better than saying, well, I got them out of the A11? So I would say there. And other places, if you feel like that provides a better look at maybe a subset. But also, references are important, and being able to reference back to some acceptable source, or some source that shows you've done your homework and you've got it there. So, but A11 is always a great place to start for those things.
So OMB is going to give you the official inflation forecast numbers through their guidance, right? They'll tell you what the number is. But one thing you can do is in the president's budget on OMB website, there's in analytical perspectives, there's a section called economic assumptions. And in the economic assumptions chapter, there's a table that compares OMB inflation forecasts with CBO inflation, Congressional Budget Office inflation forecasts, with private sector market inflation forecasts. And if you look at that table, and maybe I'll pull it up at the end of this class just to show you, you can see what the private markets forecasts are versus what the official OMB is. And that can give you an idea of the range of risk, because if there's a wide divergence, if OMB is predicting one thing and the private market and CBO is predicting something different, that tells you that there's a wide range of uncertainty about inflation. But if they're tighter, you can have more confidence in that. So I'll try to pull that up and show you at the end of the class, because it's a pretty interesting slide information. The next question: what are some ways you can incorporate new pay period data easily and quickly and accurately? I have written Excel formulas and thought about macros, but have you come across everything that is helpful? Well, one thing that we have done in the model we're going to show you is use Power Automate and Microsoft tools. Power BI actually is very useful in this, because Power BI can extract data and put it into a useful format. That's kind of what Power BI does. So it's kind of outside of this class, but you'll see an example in a few minutes. The Microsoft technology really does provide powerful tools to make that automated, because we're past the point where, like when I started out, you spent time typing numbers in. You get your payroll, and in my day it was a hard copy report, and you would type it into your Excel and use your formulas. In the world of Power BI and the Microsoft technology, and there are other tools that other companies offer, COTS tools and stuff like that, you really can avoid that. Do you have a projection template that we can remit as a starting point? That's something we probably should have thought of doing, and maybe in the future we can work on that, but it's
difficult. Yeah, it's difficult because, I can tell you, other than a fairly small agency, and I want to say 5,000-6,000 or less, it's very, it quickly outstrips the ability to manage it in a spreadsheet. So like Andy was saying, it really is helpful to have some of the more advanced tools like Power BI and some of the other tools. If your agency is about a 5,000 or so, you can run it in a spreadsheet. And, actually what I've found is, kind of start with your accounting system, your system of record, and see what reports can be generated out of that. And, maybe you can get it reformatted a little bit. So, certain columns are in, certain columns, you don't need are out. What I found useful is that we were able to do that such that I got an output report that I literally could copy and paste onto the end of an Excel table. And, an Excel table, not just a range of data, there's a difference. And automatically the table incorporates that data, and then I could run reports based on that. So again, but that, like I said, runs out of runway once you get above about 5,000 employees. It just becomes too unwieldy. Also, I love a good spreadsheet, but spreadsheets always have the problem of, are they validated? Do other people understand them? Are they documented? And so also spreadsheets, have dangers built into them that need to be addressed through other techniques, especially for something as important as an agency's payroll budget. And so I'd say that's why it's tough to say a template. I can kind of tell you what it would look like, what things might need to be included, but it would really depend on what your individual situation is.
Paul pointed out that recent economic assumptions are going to be released in OMB's mid-session review. That's correct. I should have brought that up. Good point. Thank you. And Power BI is still kind of new in the infancy. Excel has been around for 30 years. Power BI is maybe less than 10. And so, right. But we are finding that more and more people are learning Power BI. A practical template amount. We're going to show you a template in a little bit, but again, that's a little bit beyond the scope of this class to do at this point. But it would be, I agree completely that it would be useful, and we can, maybe when we go back to the budget line of business, we'll talk about how to do something like that in the future. Okay, I think we're coming to a point where we could take a break. So let's take a break. We'll come back at 10 o'clock.
Sounds good.
And yeah, we'll talk when we get back. Yes, we're on break. We're going to start back at 10 o'clock. Sorry. Okay, almost ready to start. Okay, welcome back. We're going to continue here in a minute. I do have a couple things I want to say. First, about this idea of the model and tools and stuff. We do have a working group on budget, personal services forecasting, and maybe we can talk with Janice and maybe make that a subject of a working group meeting where we can talk in more detail in a better way than we can do in a class about this sort of stuff. And we can also discuss in detail the tool we're going to show you in a few minutes. I've also put on the screen here the comparison of economic assumptions from the president's budget. This is it's on the LMB website under analytical perspectives. There's a section on economic assumptions. And so you can see here the consumer price index projections, and you can see in the budget, these are the official numbers the president included in his budget for 2023, 3.4%, 2.5% for 24.
And can you make that a little larger?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So you can see that the blue chip, the president's is 3.4, and you can see it in this row. And the blue chip, and this is essentially a composite of the private sector's best forecasting. And you can notice that it's very similar to what the White House does. It's only varies by maybe 0.2%. And then there's the Federal Reserve, I'm sorry, CBO's projection and the Federal Reserve's. And you can see that generally they're pretty close, right? It varies a little bit in the out years because the Federal Reserve, as you know, their target is 2% inflation rate. That's what the Federal Reserve wants for our economy. And so the Federal Reserve is optimistic that after 2026, we're going to get to 2%. You can notice that the president's budget is a little more conservative, you might say, that it's predicting a higher inflation rate. But anyways, this is a good place to get a look at what the forecasters think is likely to happen in the near future. So with that, we'll go back to the slides and I'll turn it back over to Rick.
Yeah, we're on slide 31, I believe. Or next slide. Yep, average compensation. There we go. So average compensation is a concept we want to get into here because it has a lot of utility. So it's an important element when you're dealing with things in a macro sense, when you don't have necessarily specifics on grade or location of like where new positions are going to go, or when you're dealing with aggregated data like from your entire agency. It trades a little bit of theoretical accuracy, or the idea that we can add up all the elements and get to an exact number for ease of use. And it's really derived by taking, the total cost of during a given period divided by either, and again, you need to know what base you're using, the number of occupied positions or the FTE. And those both have a utility in different ways. And that's why it's important to understand, which average you're using, average compensation per position or average compensation per FTE. And again, like any average, you have to be alert for any sort of outliers or data which could skew the average too high or too low. Maybe you've got a concentration of employees in a very high cost or very low cost region, and that needs to be factored in. And so the average is not going to be as predictive as you would hope. It also is important to know that, well, that's great. Your average pay is, something now, but is there something about to happen that's going to, radically change that, such that you can't just use that as a straight projection? Again, knowing what is happening in the data is important. And again, it should only include elements that are part of regular pay. And that's, my approach. Things that have a separate discretionary control function, like awards or relocation, retention, and recruitment incentives, or student pay reimbursement, or student loan, I'm sorry. Any things that have, another decision process outside of regular pay should be dealt with separately. They should not be part of that average compensation. By putting them in there, it's sort of assuming that, if you take your total award budget and divide it by the number of, positions or FTE, then you're really incorporating that everybody's going to get an average award of, let's say, $500. And that's probably not the way your award system works. So I think that's important to take those elements out, those other pay elements out, and deal with them separately, and keep, the regular pay like we defined up front, clean as far as the data streams, so you know what you're working with. Any questions on that? Okay. So like I said, here's a couple different ways to look at it. You can look at average compensation for all positions, again, vacant and occupied. And that sort of gives you, like what could our average compensation be? And again, that's compensation means budget, personnel pay plus benefits. If we were fully staffed, this is what we would look like. Not necessarily useful in day-to-day projections, but it might be a good number to keep in mind, again, where we're headed in some sort of ultimate, if we ever became fully staffed. But again, these are not interchangeable. You have to know which base you're using, and whether that then is applicable to the next stage you want to use it for. Your average compensation for onboards, again, that would be the applicable compensation cost divided by the number of occupied positions. And that's going to give you your actual cost to date for the positions occupied for that certain date, make sure the bases are the same. That's why pay periods are so valuable, because everything works on the same schedule, for an agency and across most of government even. So you can use that to segment the data into time slices. But again, might want to look at what's your average cost per position for the people that are on board right now. That tells you something what's going on with that. And then lastly, your average compensation per FTE. And that's going to be important, because that's going to take into account that timing. If you've got a bunch of people that have only been on board, a few pay periods, there's not going to have much contribution to that cumulative cost, that average compensation cumulative cost, and it will affect that average comp. But it also is important to know, that's what we're, generating now. And it's, going to be, it factors in that timing factor that's so critical to things. So again, all three, neither one of a bad number, but they have to be used correctly and applied correctly to what you're, looking at. I think, in my opinion, the most useful one is the average cost per FTE, because it takes into that timing base into the calculation, and then you can use it for with modifications, or in the next fiscal year for predicting what your average FTE costs will be the next year. But again, that's my opinion, and with some reason, but that's the one I prefer to use most of the time. All right, benefit rates. All right, so benefit rates are kind of like the same concept, because like we talked about a little bit before, there are so many elements of employee benefits that are outside the control of the agency, then dependent on employee choice. So every November we get open season, people can radically change their healthcare costs. Like I said, they might go from the cheapest one to the most expensive one, and what OPM pays is a formula within that, and is capped, but it still can make a big difference if an employee is on the cheapest plan, because I think it's 75% of the cost up to a certain cap. Well, 75% of one number could be a lot less than 75% of another, and so it's going to be very challenging to predict and model that. Again, you're not going to walk around and, hey, is everybody changing their their healthcare this open season? No, you're not going to deal with that. People have babies, people adopt children, people's life situations changes. They might go from single to single plus one to family and back to single, and who knows? And you're not going to be able to track all that. So most agencies have found it's better to use an aggregate rate to include benefit costs and total compensation. And so what that means is this is one where really the average is important, because you can look at your total, object class 12, again, for those elements that are part of regular, benefits, kind of the match to regular pay, and divide that by a relative base, and, look at what that's generating, per position or per FTE. And you can also look at that total object class 12, mostly 12.1, compared to, the regular pay, 11.1 is most of it, and say, well, wow, if I've got $1 million in payroll, I've got $400,000 in benefits, I've got a 40% benefit rate. So for every dollar I pay in pay, I'm going to have to escalate that by about 40% to make sure I cover the benefit, kind of the benefit mix I'm experiencing. And so that really has been found to be probably more useful than trying to, sort of spend the time to chase the details of benefit selections and really monitor it that closely. It's one of those numbers that doesn't change a lot over time, but it changes enough that you can retrack the benefit. Every pay period you can measure your average benefit cost or average benefit rate if you want to, but you'll find that it changes very little over time. It's also important if you have particular employee types, and I call out law enforcement positions here, or firefighters or another one. They have significantly different benefit costs because their retirement, the employer's retirement contribution is about 10 percentage points greater than it is for non-law enforcement and firefighter positions. In other words, the government pays roughly 40% to their retirement versus roughly 30%. And those numbers may not be correct, but it's about the right scale. And so you've got to use separate rates for those populations because, again, that would be an outlier and it would tend to skew the average, but yet not be predictive of either group. So if you've got separate, if you've got special agents or, again, firefighters or any sort of position that has different benefits, different retirements, then you need to factor that in separately. I saw a question about the slide deck. Yeah, the slide decks are going to be available on the website. So one thing so yeah, A11 section 32.3 has the information on agency retirement system contribution rates. And I highlight that because those rates change over time. And so it's frankly one of the first places I go to when a new A11 comes out, when I was working, was to check those benefit rates, because we had a couple years where some of the FERS positions changed 5 or 6 percentage points. And that's a big deal, when all of a sudden you go from contributing 25% to your employees' retirement versus 20%. And so they do now mark it as a change, in their list of changes index. That wasn't always the case. But I always check section 32.3 to look at those benefit rates to make sure I've got the right section. Again, that's OMB A11 32.3. And then that's in the 2023
we have a couple
edition.
of questions here.
Yeah, I was going to say that section could change in a newer version of A11, so just be aware of that.
So would you mind saying how you determine the benefits rate again? I think we're going to cover that coming up, but if you want to say some words about that. And then also, if you are already doing employee by employee historicals each pay period, why use an aggregated benefit percentage over the exact benefit percentage for each employee?
Because each employee is going to have their own benefit rate, and probably for doing projections, again, unless you have a very small agency and you can do it at that level of detail, you're going to want to do an aggregate percentage for the future. And more importantly, for new positions that come on board, like in a budget request, you obviously have no idea what level of insurance and what plan they're going to select for new employees that are going to be hired 18 months from now. And so your aggregate benefit rate is as good a predictor as you've got to add benefit cost to those requests for a new position. Does that answer your question? Hope so.
Okay.
All right. The next slide actually shows the some calculations that we talked about. So we can flip to that. Yep. Aggregate is useful for future hires. Someone just chimed in. Yep.
Next slide.
Yep, that slide there. You're good. So, again, kind of like I said, is, to calculate it, you have to understand the elements of the BOCs at a more detailed level. So you want to get down into the 3 and 4 digit BOCs and see, which ones you want to include, which ones you don't, and have some methodology for that. These are part of regular pay. These are not, those sort of things. Again, awards, relocation incentives, those sort of things are dealt with in a separate decision-making process and aren't really part of regular pay and benefits. So those should be really dealt with separately. It's also important to know, so just a little bit of a side, many things that hit pay will generate, especially OASDI, which is the FICA charges, FICA charges, Federal Insurance Contribution Act. That's the 7.62% we pay. Almost everything that hits pay will also get that percentage, but it doesn't get health care and other things applied to it. And so it's important to know which elements within pay are subject to which benefit calculations. But again, an aggregate rate usually takes care of that. So as I said, you can look at it by, coming up with your base of object class 11 and coming up with your base of object class 12 and dividing the 12 by the 11, and that will give you the benefit rate you can apply. And then you can use that rate to escalate or accelerate what you predict your salary cost to be to get to your total compensation costs. As I said, it trades a little bit of accuracy, to the question about doing employee by employee. Yeah, that would be the most accurate, at least, to look for in the current year. But, it's tough to do when you get beyond a few thousand employees. And for new employees, you'd have it would be, you'd end up using an average for the new employees because you have no idea what they're going to select. The other reality is, ironically, over time, the federal government's contribution to FERS retirement is actually going down. So newer employees receive less of a contribution, not TSP, their actual FERS pension, than older employees did. So if you're not aware of it, there's 3 different classes of FERS now. There's FERS retirement, there's FERS RAE, which is RAE, again, this is an A11, and FERS FRAE, which stands for further revised. Right now, I should say there's 2. The 2 are the same benefit rate the government pays on the employee's behalf, but they've shown potential to change that over time. So you'll also need to know what retirement system employees are subject to. If you have some workers that are still in civil service retirement system, the older system that predates FERS, that has a fixed rate that hasn't changed. But those rates are changing over time, and it's good to stay abreast of that. Again, that's in A11. So are we comfortable with, there we go. Are we comfortable with aggregate benefit rate? Go ahead and move on. Okay. Thanks.
There's a question.
Yeah, I'm just looking at that. It's a good point for the rises and the future hires. Do you use A, employee by employee historicals, or an aggregate for future hires, or B, aggregate for all employees? So it depends, in the classic, qualified answer. Typically I'll use an aggregate pretty often, unless there's a real small, maybe a work unit or a real unique, job category, like I said, like firefighters or something like that. I would use an aggregate for them. Again, you really quickly run out of, sort of computational, time and horsepower to add up more than a few hundred employees type individual selections. And so, it's easier to pull a report, since the reports can be focused by, an org code, down to the branch or division level. You can get your aggregates pretty tuned in there without dropping all the way down into individuals. So I'd say, that's the kind of the test I would use. Don't go lower than you really need to get the job done to your level of satisfaction. So, we look at this, so for calculating historical benefit rates, do you use a build or historical average? So a build average says, you look at each benefit component and see what it contributes to the overall rate. And we'll do that in a second to kind of illustrate that. It's great. You get it's each employee based on their choices. That's great, but the ease of updates, it's difficult. You have to, if somebody changes, they have a life event off schedule with open season, they go from single to family plan of a much more expensive health care and those sort of things. Most times you don't want to have to keep track of all those changes, every 2 weeks. And like I said, it's very difficult to use for more than a few employees. It just runs into, like I said, you're updating a lot of stuff. You even might effectively run into, line count limitations. A lot of times in Access and Excel, Excel's gotten a lot bigger, but it still gets really unwieldy when you start to use a lot of the available rows. So it's gonna run out of horsepower. The historical average uses the data from the accounting system. It's all validated back to that. You can aggregate it at, find a level of detail that's available in your accounting system, or summarized up at a higher level. It's easy in that you can download those accounting reports after every pay period and double check and see if your rate is moving. It's probably going to move tenths or less of a percentage point each rate, but you can validate that and incorporate that in as a rigor of your projection, and say, hey, every pay period we check the benefit rate to verify what it's going. And again, you can, scale it unlimited, down to whatever level of detail is available in your accounting system and then summarize from there. So, those are two, counterpoints of that. We'll take a look at the data in a second, but again, for most things above a few hundred, the historical average is going to be a lot more flexible and a lot more easier to use. So as I said, the build method's a bottoms up. It's all influenced by the individual choices. It's best used for smaller populations where to the point those individual choices have a meaningful impact. That's the other thing about, the individual choices in an agency of 12,000 people are quickly sort of lost, in the large number effect of it just doesn't make much difference. And then new employees can be priced, with an aggregate rate, but you then have to adjust it, for their personalized selections if you really want to keep that build method, sort of clean all the way through. And, again, if more than a few people, you're not probably have time to run around and say, hey, did those 5 new employees, did they, change their healthcare plan last pay period? So, it's just going to take up a lot of time. But here's the build method on the next one. So looking at the elements and the footnotes, I'll let you read those. Again, I talk about the CS, FERS, FRAY, and RAY. It's not a bad, this table I also find helpful to kind of scale, as a benchmark. So if you do an aggregate rate and you get some number like 60%, it would make me sort of stop and say, wait a second, I expected it to somewhere be in this range, let's say 35 to 45. Again, because health insurance, as I said, can vary because OPM pays a certain dollar amount up to a cap. So, the percentage that translates to, gets a little messy. But it gives you, again, a scale, something to, a reasonableness check, I'll call it, to say, well, if I calculate the aggregate and it's 20%, then that makes me scratch my head and make me want to look into it. Or if it's 60%, I want to look into it. So it's not bad having this in mind, just to kind of know what seems about right. And then you can double check, most of these are also in separate sub-object classes, depending on your system, like at the 4 or, whatever level of detail. Some systems have a 5-digit level. You can check on that and maybe check those rates individually to see if they're where you want to be. The TSP agency match, as I said, new employees now are set at 5%, but you might find your workforce, was from a time that people, could set, it was started at 0 and they had to decide to opt in. Or, in aggregate, it could be less than that, but, you want to take a look at that. You can look at that individually. But again, that gives you an idea. It's going to vary a lot. And again, it's going to be much, much less or much, much greater for special positions like anything with a shorter retirement cycle, like firefighters, special agent, law enforcement, air traffic controllers, and I'm sure there's some others I don't know about. All right, go ahead and so, like I said, the historical average method trades a little bit of that, for an ease of use and a scalability. So it uses the actual cost and staffing reports to calculate that average benefit rate. And you can do it, again, at the lowest level available in your accounting system. Is that a unit or division or the entire agency? You can do that together for it. And you can look at the cost of the applicable benefit strategies, like categories, and just like we said on this previous slide, at every one point in time, you can look at it. What does it look like mid-year now versus mid-year for the last 3 fiscal years? Pick up and see if there's any seasonality. Is there something that causes the benefit rate to change at a certain point? One thing that can be, if you have a lot of very highly compensated and higher graded employees or a special compensation program, you might get employees that meet the OASDI. Part of the FICA charge has a cap. Above a certain pay raise, it stops collecting that contribution. And so if you have employees that hit that cap during the year, you'll actually see your benefit rate drop as they start to hit that cap. And so you might want to factor that into your model that, thanks, it's 168,000 and change, I think. But anyway, and factor that into your model or your projections that your benefit rate is actually going to drop, when that happens for your workforce. Sometimes it's going to be very late in the year. Other workforces, it might be a little bit earlier, but you'll know what it is. And like I said, this approach relieves the analyst of having to monitor individual benefit selections, since that's not really impactful on a large population. Next slide, please. Again, the benefit calculation, historical average is going to be useful for mid to larger size organizations. I'd have a regular schedule to review it. Maybe it's not every pay period, maybe it's quarterly, maybe it's monthly. Again, what gives you the confidence that you're sort of testing the waters often enough to know where you are and you're keeping your projections up to date. Back on the next slide, Andy, I'm sorry.
Well, wait, we got a question. Does the benefit rate tend to go up or down for people who work a lot of overtime? And
that's a good question. Yeah. Overtime's a weird thing. So overtime will tend to lower your effective benefit rate. And the reason I say that is because overtime pay is subject to FICA, but not the other elements of benefits. So if you look at that when we did the build method, there's the different elements of the benefit rate. If you actually, Andy, you want to go back to that slide, I think it's 37. More back. There it is. So overtime's kind of funky in that these first two, every dollar is subject to. And I think actually it gets retirement contribution. I have to check, but it doesn't get health insurance. You don't get another health insurance charge if you work an hour of overtime. And other things don't impact it. And so that's why I say overtime's a little unique. You'd have to take a look at it and test your payroll to see what it affects. But if you have a very large, like I know some of the back when I was in defense depot maintenance, the workforce in the depots are hourly, wage grade employees, and so they tend to have a lot of overtime, and that can very much skew your benefit rate because it doesn't receive all the benefits on those incremental overtime hours.
Well, and also it's important to remember that forecasting overtime is very different than forecasting regular wages, right? Because overtime forecast, one, you can put a budget on overtime and just say we stop it. And sometimes agencies do that. And second, overtime can be tied to critical events that may or may not be able to be predicted. So normally when you're doing forecast, you do it on the regular compensation and you extract out the overtime, and you may have a separate model or separate methodology for forecasting overtime use. That depends a lot about a combination of the policy that your agency does with overtime, when is it allowed, when it is not, and also what kind of critical events drive overtime. So that's kind of a separate animal that you need to be very clear and distinct about how you're treating overtime in any forecasting system.
Yeah, that's a good point, and thank you. And also, your workforce, might have a seasonality. The best one I can think of is wildland firefighting. It occurs in different, mainly in the summertime, in most of the West. And so that obviously is going to be where that big chunk of overtime shows up, for those sort of things. Other agencies have, I think one of the most interesting one is the Census Bureau. They have a 10-year pulse in all their pay and many of their costs to do the decadal census. And so, but they know that that's going to change every 10 years because of that work effort. So again, it comes back to knowing your data and knowing your workforce.
So there's a question about what about the unused vacation payout? Some workers leaves when people leave the federal government, and that's always been a real challenge, right? Because you can't predict when people are going to leave. There used to be like people would leave in January for tax reasons because they didn't want to pay the higher taxes and the lump sum that if it came in the previous year where they got the full federal salary plus the lump sum, that might push them into a higher tax bracket. So in my experience, people would wait till January or the spring to leave. But again, normally that's kind of a separate forecasting issue because you can't really generate based on historical averages because, if you have a lot of, older workers, when they retire, a batch of them retires, you don't know that same batch is going to retire the next year. Rick, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, exactly. again, it's all a matter of like how many people do it. And, you have a little bit of a capping factor in that, use or lose. If somebody enters the year with a full amount of use or lose and then earns their full, salary or full leave accrual, it's like 400 some hours is the maximum they're going to be able to go out with. So one approach would be to, to budget for that as sort of a worst case scenario. Or it's also kind of shows up like regular pay. I can tell you when I retired, I finally, my last, pay statement was nothing but the annual leave lump sum. And it shows up like regular pay. So it's kind of be washed into the data. And, if they do retire like in January, then more than likely that position is going to be vacant for quite a large position of the year. And so that position is going to end up being cheaper than a fully staffed position. So you're kind of taken care of. But again, if you've got something that's going to, again, knowing what's going to happen, if you've got, a big downsizing that's coming through and you expect a lot of people to take early retirement, then that might need to be factored in. But other than that, it tends to wash through. Excuse me.
Okay, which slide do we want to go to?
We're on, I think, about 40. The historical average method, I think, actually covered most of it. Yeah. So like any average, you want to acquire the numbers you need from your accounting system. Always, I can't stress enough, use the system of record to base that on. Then you've got that accountability. Again, you should exclude elements that are subject to management control, awards, overtime, those sort of things. Divide that benefit cost by salary cost to determine your rate. Again, you can also do it on an FTE basis, which again, I find a little bit more useful. And then regularly monitor this, monthly, periodically, whatever works for you to make sure that you're using the most recent data available. Okay, next is a question.
No, I think we covered that question.
The benefit, that one?
Oh, this question, sorry.
Yeah, no worries. So what is the benefit of using a benefit rate versus making predictions about benefit costs in individuals?
Just wait a second.
Yep.
Benefit rate tends to go up or down when people, oh wait. You can prove one.
Well, you can really, you can prove both of them. You could have a, 10,000 lines of data that shows you've added up everybody's, individual. And I think what we would find, and this is a good test maybe if one wants to do, try to do a small segment or, a segment of an organization, in detail, add it up, and then do the aggregate. What I think you're going to find is, you're going to do all that work for the detail and find it's 40.257, and then you're going to do the aggregate and find it's 40.3. Was all that detailed work, really, giving you a functionally different figure to use versus, an aggregate method. But, that's not a bad test to do if one wants to do that to kind of validate it, and always change that. Benefit can change. I just saw a benefit can change based on inflation. You can estimate cost of living. Yeah, and in fact that I didn't see it in this year's A11, although I can't say I exhaustively read it. But in previous years, sometimes there's been an estimate of benefit cost increases versus separate than pay. You can also sometimes, and I think it would be a valid thing, is OPM will release data about the coming healthcare costs. That healthcare premiums are going up an average of 12.7%. Well, you might be able to use that in your budget projections, and at least you've got the defensibility, kind of the backup of citing OPM's press release or their communication about it, and in your budget projections. OPM or OMB may push back on it, but at least you've got that backup that, hey, this is what OPM says is happening, and you can use that. But yeah, I think again, given that many elements are up to individuals, it just kind of becomes a major effort to kind of get to the same place.
Here's the answer.
Reasonableness should be your guide. It really comes down to what gives you a reasonable answer. If you find that it doesn't, then methodologically you might need to make some changes. But again, if you're happy with the, that it's reasonable, then it can save you a lot of time. And I think this is over to you, Andy.
Okay, we've had the break. So now we're going to talk about how do you price existing staff, okay? And we're thinking about the situation when you're doing budget formulation and you're going to have a budget request for the next year, and you need to figure out how much you're going to need to request for personal services. And so this is a forecast, and how can you do that? Now we're going to use a new thing that we've never tried in the budget line of business before. And we're building a training environment with simulated data, and we're calling it for now the Department of Citizen Services. And we've built the departmental management organization. And so we've actually created a database that has budget data for each of these organizations that are kind of typical for a normal if there is such a thing as a normal department. So you see it has the Office of Secretaries and Leg Affairs and Intergovernment, and then Management and Human Resources and Procurement, all these headquarters operations. And then we've created subordinate organizations. And we've populated this with budget data, including personnel files and data tables. And we have the budget structure, we have budgets for organizations, we have created a position table that has organization and grade, and we created a human resources table that has whether the position's filled or not, the grade, the step of the person, the region, and the pay type, ESES or GS or law enforcement. And so when you're building a model, you need these tables. You need a position table that includes all funded positions. You have to make sure that the positions are assigned to organizations. You need to know the pay type, right? And you need to know the maximum grade level because it's not filled. And we know that sometimes people get put in positions like, they're a 15 when they're a 14 with the anticipation that they will be promoted at some point. And you also need to put in the region, right? Because the regional pay scale is in the regional pay in the federal government. And then you need a human resources table that includes all the staff, like all the people who fill it, and that assigns each member of a staff to a position. Again, you need pay type, you need the pay grade, you need the start date, you need the step increase date, and you need the region, and you also, so the GS level. So we've created a pay table in our simulated agency that has about 1,000 employees. And we're going to use that for the simulation that we're going to show you in a minute. Now, there are different ways to forecast, right? We've talked about this average salary method. So then you gather all the personal compensation expenditures, 11 and 12. You determine your FTE, right? And then you divide your expenditures by FTE. And then you multiply that FTE, that figure times the FTE at the end of the fiscal year. Like generally you use the last month of the fiscal year. So if you're developing your budget for the BY, you want to use the last year of the CY. Now that may actually be a forecast, right? Because the year hasn't ended when you formulate your budget. Why do you use the last month? Because if your payroll is going down and you use an average payroll for the whole year, you're essentially going to overstate your forecast because the average pay would be higher because you start at a high level, you go to a lower level, and then the midpoint would be higher. Likewise, if your payroll is increasing, you start at a lower level, you increase to a higher level, you're going to under forecast because your actual pays would be lower. And I hope I explained that well. And also the idea here is your workforce, the assumption is that it's a fairly stable workforce, because if you're in the next budget year, you expect a lot of variation, it impacts your current services forecast.
Yeah, so Andy, I tend to think of it, the last pay period or last month is sort of like, like inventory. The ending inventory from one period is the beginning inventory of the next period. And so by using that last period, pay period or month, you're using the most recent data.
So you can also do this using the build method, and then you can get the reports with detailed information for each individual employee, and kind of build it out for the next year. And I did this when I was the budget director for SBA. The way we did budget forecasts is we had the headquarters at that time had about 3,000 people, and we went through every single person, and we had a giant spreadsheet with 3,000 rows in it. And it was a lot of work. And like Rick said, I'm not sure that we really, that was the best use of our time, because it was a lot of work to get detailed. But then you add the most recent.
Andy, you went on mute.
Wonder what happened there. Sorry about that. Let's start back at the top, because I'm not sure whether when I went on mute. So with the forecast build method, step one is you use the reports with detailed data for each organization pay and benefit costs for FY year broken out by pay period. And I don't know whether I was on mute or not, but when I was the budget director of SBA, we had about 3,000 people in the S&E account at that time, and we had a 3,000 persons spreadsheet, 3,000 rows with each individual position and literally the names of the people. And we tried to figure out exactly through the build method what the forecast for the next year would be. Step two, you analyze the data for the remainder of the FY by one of these methods. You can add the most recent pay periods multiplied by the number of remaining pay periods to the actuals, or you can add the average of elapsed pay periods data multiplied by the number of remaining pay periods, or you can price each remaining pay period using insights about staffing changes. And Rick, do you have anything to add to this?
Nope.
Oh, okay. So you price existing staff in the current FY. You use recent data as the most accurate way of predicting costs. We talked about that. You use data from payroll, timekeeping, and financial service systems. And for current FY projections, the FY to date data is projected forward to the end of the fiscal year. So you might be formulating your budget in July, and so you have to forecast your data out to what you think it's going to be in September, the month before the year end. And then you want to try to build in known events. So if there's a hiring surge going on, you think about that, right? If they're going to hire a certain number of people in the next 3 months to the end of the fiscal year. And you can use multiple projections with different assumptions to try to focus that. But given the limits of forecasting, you may want to include a reserve as part of that process. So the future FY is used for calculating the cost of current workforce into the future years. It is also often referred to as the current services level of base cost. And here, because most budgeting and formulation is base plus initiatives, right? And so you're trying, and what we're going to show you in a minute is a tool for estimating the base cost and the current services level, which means no changes. You're not doing new program implementations or things like that. So the future, then you include the future year's pay assumption, and we're going to show you how we do that in our model. And then you can also build into it other known events. So if you know that you've been funded for a major program increase that has new hiring, you have to work that into it. Is there a rate used for funding reserves at SBA? Well, it was 25 years ago, so it's probably changed. But we try to do it 1 or 2% was what we did. But again, the reserve rate you have to calculate based on your agency's history. Like, do you have a lot of variability? Also, do you have some policy changes that are going on that are going to affect the structure of your workforce? So you do that. So now we're going to switch. Give me a minute. I'm going to switch over and we're going to show you the tool that we want to use. So I'm going to take a minute to find it. Okay. This is a budget system that we built. It's built on Power BI with Power Automate features. So this is a pure Microsoft tool. It's something you could build in your agency with tools that most people get through Microsoft licensing agreements. That's standard Office 365. It is got a SQL database on the back, but this is a tool. So when you're formulating your budget and you want to start, first step is get the current services level. And what we have here is a budget. We navigate by what you're doing in the budget process. And so the first thing you want to do is set the base budget, right? And now we're operating as if you're in the departmental budget office. This is like the budget director or their budget director's designation, because we're going to make something, assumptions for inflation that apply to the whole organization, right? And that you don't want every office having a different inflation assumption, right? So you're going to have one thing. So in this system, we just click on this and we set an inflation rate. And you can do that there. Now, let's say for just practice and to learn something, let's just assume our inflation rate is 0, right? And we're going to enter the inflation rate as 0. We decided that federal employees are not going to get a pay raise because, and this actually happened in the 90s. There was periods of times where there was a pay freeze for a couple of years, if I remember right. And so we're going to assume that those bad days are coming back and we've got a 0% pay inflation. So all the federal employees are boo, but that's just for training here. We're going to do that. So now what you want to do is compute the base manpower. And again, so now we're switching our roles a little bit, right? We're going to assume now that we're a budget analyst that's working in one of the organizations. And we're going to go and say, okay, you're the budget analyst that was responsible for the Office of Secretary. And you're going to try to, first you want to check and see what your organization's staffing level is. So you can just go over here and you can see, look, the position detail is this, that you have 44 people in your organization and they're split like this. And you can check and say, okay, that's good. We got it. That makes sense. And then you can check the subordinate offices. Okay, that's right. You can go Center for Special Issues. You can collect and see what your is. But then so now we've checked our staff and we know it's okay. We're going to go back and we're going to calculate our base manpower caps. Now here's the teaching point and why we're doing this calculation. Now look at this. We said a 0% pay raise, but costs are going up, right? So the personnel compensation is this, the personal benefits are here, the total personal cost is $8,144,000. Now remember, this is based on the 1,000 employees that we created in our database. Now it's going up. Now how come personnel service costs are going up when there's a 0% pay raise? Any thoughts? What's causing the cost to go up? There you go, within grade pay raises. So within grade, it's important to remember that even with a 0% pay raise, the within grade increases are going to drive, and also promotions. And there may be some benefit changes, but in this model, it really is wage within grade increases. And that's, in this particular example, is about 1%. But you can calculate it for your agency, and there's tools and ways to do that, because it may vary depending on the age and the structure and the grades of your workforce. But look at that. So just this wants to demonstrate the impact that even with a 0% increase, you still have cost increases for personal services. Now, OMB does not give you a allow you to request additional funds for wage and grade increases. Their assumption is that your vacancy rate will cover that. And that's an assumption. And there is ways to calculate and validate that. But that goes. Okay. But let's go back and see what happens when you give a pay raise. We'll go back to the department again, and we're going to change this to 4%. Correct? And you're going to 4%. So now that we've set up the department's budget is assuming a 4% inflation. Now let's go back and compute the buying power. Now here's the teaching point that we're going to talk about here. So now you can see it's 4%. It's the Office of Secretary. We calculate it. And notice now that you can see the significant increases year to year. It's 4% roughly increase. But notice if you do the math, again, you're not going to get a 4% increase. You'll actually get something like a 5% increase because you have the wage grade increases. So that's an important point to remember. And the point we're using this and showing this is to show you the impact of different inflation rates. Now we can, with this particular tool, you can calculate it out and use different things. So are there any questions on this? So the offsets would be handled what we're going to talk about this afternoon. And this afternoon, after we talk about this, we're going to show you how to do price increases to estimate the cost of new initiatives. And an offset is nothing more than a negative new initiative, right? So if you're going to offset a reduced salary, you treat it as a new initiative. And we're going to talk about that this afternoon. Any other questions? So this just is an example of a tool you can use. There's lots of tools out there. Some people build them in Excel, but we just wanted to show you how something can be done with a Power BI, Power Automate tool that is software that most of your agencies own. And so now we'll go back to the slides.
I think, Andy, the question was about the offsets necessary to absorb your current services level. So you may not show an offset there directly. That's a good question. It's more, this is your new current services level. And what other adjustments, maybe your non-salary side goes down, non-pay object class 21 through 41 is adjusted to deal with that. Or as Andy said, it's once you factored in, staffing issues like an attrition rate or something like that, it might end up that you come out about the same or so. But typically in those base adjustments, you would have to, you'd have to be able to explain why your base increases, and in the passback process, OMB would decide whether or not to sort of honor the whole sort of mixture of current services level changes or not.
So what our tool does is to answer the question is that we do use wage increases. We essentially are simulating an HR data table, and most human resource data tables will tell you the start date, tell you when the wage and grade increases or that people are eligible for, and has all the data. So we're simulating that, and that's what you can build into the tool.
Yeah, the second part of that, no, we don't project promotions. You really can't include a projection of promotions. If you have a vacant position, you might include when you think that position would be filled, but whether or not it would be filled externally with, a net new position or, a promotion for someone in the existing staff, there's really no way to project that because you just don't know the outcome of the selection process. So more than likely, you'd predict it as a new position, and then if it was, an interior or an internal selection, you select an internal employee for promotion, then that difference between, let's say, their 13 and their 14 would be made up in the fact that their 13 position would be vacant until it's refilled. So Again, that's sort of down in the weeds. Those things tend to roll over and take care of each other. But you can predict for that, but more at a separated from the position details, more aggregate.
Well, there are certain positions that are like 7-9, grade 7
Yeah,
through
a
9.
career ladder position, that sort of
Career-
promotion. Yeah, the model can deal with that.
We could build that into it. If you could identify the specific position as a career ladder and then, show when the person is projected. That is feasible to do. We just, for this little educational thing, to just show you the possibilities that are out there, we did not do that, but you certainly could. Okay, any other questions? Okay, well, we're going to come back this afternoon and we're going to start with pricing a new positions for a new initiative, right? We're going to start with there and then we're going to talk about operating plans and everything else. So we hope you join us again at 1 o'clock so we can finish this out. Again, we'll stick around for if there are any questions. And
Okay. You're ending, Andy?
Yep.
Okay.
Well, we'll just give them a second okay, just we're getting thank yous. I don't see any questions. Well, thank you for listening, and we hope to continue the conversation this afternoon.
Thank you so much to our speakers, Andy and Rick. They will join us at 1 o'clock for part 2. As a friendly reminder, we'll be sending out a post-session survey at the end of the form. We appreciate your feedback. On behalf of Budget Line of Business, we'd like to say thank you for our first session, attending our first session of the spring 2024 forum.
Jeff has a question. Go ahead, Jeff.
Mhm.
No, I raised my hand when I was trying to react. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay, sorry.
No, I'm sorry. You have to ask your question now.
I'll also include in the chat if you do not have the link to join us at the next session.
Power BI and where you might go